We seek one mystery with another mystery, ourselves. We seek God with the mystery that is ourselves. And we are mysterious to ourselves because God's mystery is in us. Gary Wills wrote this about the impossibility of fully comprehending God, and yet still we can draw closer to the Holy One. And I'm very grateful for friends who help me to see God in new ways. This week, my friend Norwood Pratt, many of our friends, sent me an article about a modern Chinese-American poet named Li Young Li. So he was born in 1957. Li's father immigrated to the United States and served as a Presbyterian pastor at an all-white church in western Pennsylvania. Infinity and eternity, they fascinate him. And in his poem, he writes about how, in the uniqueness of our nature and experience, we all encounter in a different way the ultimate being, the Tao or God. This he calls the beloved one, the darling. So Li writes this love poem about God. My friend and I are in love with the same woman. I'd write a song about her. I wish I could sing, I'd sing about her. I wish I could write a poem. Every line would be about her. Instead, I listen to my friend speak about this woman we both love, and I think of all the ways she is unlike anything he says about her, and unlike everything else in the world. Now, this poet writes about something that cannot be expressed, our deep and deepest desire to be united with God. And Jesus writes about the same, or speaks about the same thing in the Gospel of John, in his last instructions to his disciples, and then in his passionate prayer for them and for us. Now, in his last words, Jesus uses a surprising metaphor for encountering the mystery of God. He says that we meet God through friendship. So on this Mother's Day, when we celebrate the sacrifices associated with love, I want to think more with you about friendship and God. And to understand the uniqueness of Jesus' teachings, it helps us see how another great historical figure understood this same subject. Now, long before Jesus' birth, in the 4th century BC, the philosopher Aristotle studied at Plato's school in Athens. So he did this from roughly the age of 17 to 37. So for 20 years he was being educated. And then he became the tutor of Alexander the Great. And he founded a prominent library, and he used this library to gather all the greatest wisdom of the ancient world and to synthesize it into his own thought. Now, scholars estimate that we have about a third of what Aristotle wrote. And he's had a huge influence on our understanding of nature in the West. He also especially influenced the 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas, and therefore all modern Roman Catholic approaches to Christian thought. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Aristotle thought about God, then what he thought about the human condition, and then what he thought about friendship. Now, for Aristotle, God is eternal, non-material, unchanging, and perfect. He famously describes God as the unmoved mover, existing outside of the world and setting it into motion, being the beginning of all things that we experience. Now, because everything seeks the divine perfection, this God is responsible for all change in the universe, because all change comes from a kind of longing for God. We experience a world of particular things, but God knows the universal ideas that are behind them, that in a way are before them. So for Aristotle, God is pure thought, eternally contemplating himself. God is the telos, the goal or end of all things. So Aristotle begins his book Nicomachean Ethics, which is not about God, talking about what motivates all of us. And he basically says that happiness is the end at which all actions aim. So you may not go to the gym for the sake of happiness immediately in that moment, but happiness is the ultimate goal of doing that. Everything we do, he says, trace back to our desire for happiness. And the purpose of Aristotle's whole book is to help the reader to attain this goal. Happiness comes from having particular virtues. That is, particular and habitual ways of acting and of seeking pleasure. So these virtues include courage, temperance, generosity, patience. And in our interactions with others, we have social virtues, and these include amiability, sincerity, and wit. Justice, he writes, is the overarching virtue that encompasses all the others. So now that's the second section. See, we're moving right through this Aristotle part, and you're still with me. Now, Aristotle goes on to say that there are three kinds of friendship. And you'll recognize these immediately. The first kind of friendship is one based on utility. Like, what can I get from this person? So that's the first kind of friendship. The second kind of friendship, he said, is based on pleasure. So this person just makes me feel so darn good. And he said that those kinds of friendships don't last very long because those are ephemeral things. And what's useful to us and what's pleasurable to us is going to soon change. Instead, he says the most important kind of friendship is the final form of friendship, and that is what he calls friendship that's based on strength of character. So these are friends that we love, that love each other not for what they can gain or for how they please each other, but because they admire each other. They see goodness of that person's character, and they want to be near that person. So Aristotle believes that this is almost always between equals. And he says one exception might be when we see it between parents or children. He doesn't say parents or children, he says fathers and sons. But his idea is basically that there's equality that needs to be in place for that kind of friendship to take place. Now, Aristotle's also, do you remember, famous for calling human beings, he said, man is a political animal. Do you remember that part? Aristotle points out that we can accomplish really great things alone, but much greater things when we are working together, and that friendliness is a way that helps us to do this. So it partly makes us capable of accomplishing great things. It's partly what makes us human. Finally, Aristotle believes that although each person should be self-sufficient, he said that friendship is part of a good life. So now that's all of Aristotle's view of friendship. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call the good news. The Greek word for gospel, euangelion, means good news, and it's the way that we describe these stories about Jesus. And Jesus has some incredibly good news for us today, and that good news is about friendship. Now, Jesus has a radical picture of God and friendship, a kind of intimacy that is so foreign to Aristotle. And for me, one of the defining and unique features of Christianity is this exact feature that Jesus calls God Father, the most intimate of relationships. That Jesus teaches us to pray, our Father who art in heaven. And when Jesus wants to talk about what God is like, Jesus tells the story of a prodigal son, somebody who spends all his money in Las Vegas, the first century equivalent of Las Vegas, is absolutely destitute, comes back, is just climbing the last hill, and his father, wearing robes like these, picks up the hems of his robes and embarrassingly runs out to greet him, embraces him, and kisses him. That is what God is for Jesus. And really, Jesus cares not just about us thinking this, but the gestures that make it real for us. And so Jesus, in his last meal with his friends, he washes their feet to show what this means, to show what friendship is. And then, this is something that I would love someone to explain, and I know there's somebody out there who's going to explain this to me better. But the King James Version of the Bible says, there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. So Jesus is literally teaching us about love while holding one of his friends in an embrace. Now, Jesus explicitly says to them in that moment, he says, I do not call you servants anymore, but friends. Servants don't know what the master is up to, but you do. You know that the commandment that I give you is to love one another, and because you know that, you are my friends. And later in prayer, he says, God, protect them from the world. Protect them so that they may have my joy made complete in themselves. Now, this is such a revolutionary idea of love, and it means that we are connected across the centuries to people who believed in it. And one of those people is somebody from the 4th century, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. His name was Gregory of Nyssa. He was born 10 years after the First Council of Nicaea, and he participated in the First Council of Constantinople. So these were great gatherings of everyone in the world in the church to talk about what things mean. And he writes, this is my joke in the sermon, you're going to not laugh, but he writes about what it was like in those days when the council was taking place. He wrote about how everybody would be arguing about Christian doctrine. So he writes, quote, this is a long quote, and I think it's funny, and some of you might. If in this city you ask anyone for change, like money back, he will discuss with you whether the Son was begotten or unbegotten. If you ask about the quality of the bread, you will receive the answer, the Father is greater and the Son is lesser. If you suggest a bath is desirable, you will be told there was nothing before the Son was created. I just love that. All these people arguing about theology and in the marketplace. But anyway, Gregory with his friends Basil and Gregory of Nazianzus, they wondered about whether there could be a description of Jesus that would lead to faith instead of these little bickering arguments. And Gregory of Nyssa came to believe that the image of God is only fully displayed when every person, every human being is included. So no one can be left out. And in his final book, The Life of Moses, Gregory responds to a letter from a younger friend who seeks his counsel on the perfect life. So this is what the advice that Gregory gave to his young friend. He said, look at Moses. Moses, more than anyone else in history, exemplifies what it means to live a perfect life because Moses was a friend to God. True perfection is not bargaining with, pleading, tricking, manipulating, or fearing God. It is not avoiding a wicked life out of fear of punishment. It is not trying to do good because we hope for some kind of reward. And then he says, as if we are cashing in on the virtuous life through a business contract. No. Gregory closes with these words to his young admirer. We regard falling from God's friendship as the only dreadful thing, and we consider becoming God's friend the only thing worthy of honor and desire. This is the perfection of life. As your understanding is lifted up to what is magnificent and divine, whatever you may find will certainly be for the common benefit in Jesus Christ. Now, on Thursday night, I was talking to my friend Paul Fromberg, who is the rector of St. Gregory of Nyssa Church in San Francisco, and he mentioned this very sophisticated woman who began coming to church there, and she ultimately decided to become a Christian. And in short, she moved from having Aristotle's view of friendship as a kind of group of superior people who are equal. So that kind of view of friendship that Aristotle promoted, to having a view of friendship that was more like Jesus' view. And so this is the quote. I'm going to change one of the words because it's not sermon. You can't use it in a sermon. But this is what she said. She said, because I go to church, I can have real affection for people who annoy the heck out of me. She didn't say heck. They don't say that anymore. She said, my affection is no longer just based on affinity. Now, let that sink in for a little bit, like what we are to each other here in this room with each other. I've been so thoroughly transformed by Jesus' idea of friendship, and my life has become full of Jesus' friends, full of people who I never would have met if I had just followed Aristotle's advice of just make friends with the people who are equal with you and superior to everybody else. Together, we know that in Christ, unity does not have to mean uniformity. And before I go, I don't really have any time left, but I'm going to tell you the story about a friend that I met in church at Christ Church in Los Altos. And her name was Alice Lars, and when I met her 25 years ago, she was already like a couple years away from being a great-grandmother. She and her husband, George, had grown up together in Washington, D.C., and grown up in apple orchards. She was a farmer all the way through in her outlook. He had been an engineer, and she nursed him through his death from Alzheimer's disease. She was an amazing caregiver to him. And some of my favorite memories of Alice are going to her house we'd have these youth group parties at her pool parties in the backyard of her house, and she would always be there and have the best food, the best hospitality. In her 60s, she started a company called Alice's Stick Cookies Company. And last week, Heidi and I were in the grocery store. We saw Alice's cookies still in the box right there. And let me tell you more about her that people didn't know about. So we had a rotating homeless shelter at Christ Church. So 1 month a year, we had the homeless shelter at our place. And here's this widow, this woman living by herself, and invariably the shelter guests would be staying with her for certain periods of time. People didn't know that, but that was what was happening behind the scenes. When things were divided in the church about whether to start a school, she volunteered to be the senior warden. She was humble. She was practical. She knew how to get things done. There was no outward sign that she was really a saint. Now, 2 weeks ago, she had her funeral, and I was here on some official capacity, and I never really had the chance to say goodbye to her. But I know that one day we will be together in God. And that's just one person. In this room, there are hundreds of people who are like her, who have stories that are invisible to us on the surface, but who we're getting to know through God's grace. Ram Dass was a dear friend of our former dean, Alec Jones. He used to say, the name of the game we are in is called being at one with the beloved. God gives each of us to each other in part so that we can learn to love him. We seek one mystery, God, with another mystery, ourselves. And we are mysterious to ourselves because God's mystery is in us. In a world where friendship can seem to be only for utility or pleasure, I pray that like Jesus, you will be blessed by friends, that you will find perfection of life, that you will even find friendship with God.